All right, so Richard, we've been talking about these negotiations, which have been on and off, on and off, on and off for months. And one of the things I keep hearing from sources in the room is that when they negotiate with Mossad and get a deal with Mossad, that's more reliable than what happens when that interlocutor goes back to Tel Aviv, presents it to the government, and that's where it all falls apart. Have you been in any kind of these negotiations where intelligence agencies are involved? Can you explain to me the role they kind of play in something like this? It's a little confusing.
Well, the answer to your question is yes, I have been. And there is always, well, I think I have to be a little bit discreet, but there are often what I would describe as different levels of diplomacy, particularly when you're involved in negotiations with enemies. Do you see what I mean? So, in terms of negotiating over Gaza, I would imagine that the intelligence links, let's say between Qatar, Israel, then the dialogue that would go on between Mossad and Saudi Arabia, the Egyptians. I mean, it's well known that these links exist, but I think that they gain huge importance when traditional diplomacy, which isn't often that discreet, it's got this sort of public dimension. When you need other channels, then those channels can become highly influential, and usually they run pretty much from, well, in the UK, it's maybe the chief talking to the prime minister with other people present. I mean, I don't want to go into detail, but I certainly found myself in some very extraordinary situations when I was chief, which were fascinating and thoroughly enjoyable. And the other advantage of that link is the government can sort of deny that it exists, and they don't have to admit to it. So there's sort of dimension for discussion, which is off the map, but can be very influential, particularly in times of sort of crisis or conflict.
But it seems to me there are two ways. If you're a head of state and you're trying to negotiate with an adversary, there's two ways to use your intelligence arm, right? You can do it the way that the Israelis have been doing it a little bit in the Middle East, is to have your head of the intelligence service go and be the one doing the negotiation, or you can have someone like you in a back room when you need to go get a check on the BS you're being spun at the table, run back, try to get the lay of the land and come back. Is one of those more effective than the other? Does it depend on the situation?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. They both run in parallel. And, you might be there to say, well, that's bullshit. And the other thing, you excuse my language on the podcast.
No, I was going to say it, but I'm always the one who swears, so I'm glad it was you this time.
But I think the other thing you've got to remember is it's quite possible in these very tense and high risk situations that there may be intelligence sources involved which are bearing down on day-to-day events. And
how do you mean?
Well, I'm going to have to leave you to interpret that. Surely you pick it up. So there may be aspects of the negotiations where you're well aware of what the other side's position is, and it isn't necessarily being stated perfectly.
So then what is your role? Is your role to be there in the room to call bullshit, or is your
very seldom you're hardly ever going to be in the room. No. You're going to be in the background.
So it's one of those, I know that you know that they know, and we know they know we know, but we're going to say the thing anyway.
Well, some weird things happen. I mean, and I can think of all sorts of situations.
Give us one anecdote that you think you can share about some sort of similar situation. You can change names and locations and decades.
Well, various events in Serbia and during the bombing of Serbia by NATO, there were some quite tense and difficult situations around that in which intelligence played an important role. And I'm not going to go much further than that. I'm going to have to leave it to your imagination.
Oh, fine. When you look at this potential agreement that may or may not have been agreed to by the time our lovely audience is hearing this podcast, are there elements of it that stand out, and are there elements to you that seem to be missing?
Well, the one thing that I'm not clear about, and this came out when we were talking with Shlomo, which he made this point about the essence of Israel's commitment to its citizens and their recovery, from kidnaps or points of crisis. Does this agreement cover all remaining living hostages or not? Because if it doesn't, it falls short on that principle. And the risk must be that it won't meet anybody's expectations if there are still going to be hostages held inside Gaza.
I am still wondering, other than the incoming Donald Trump, I can't think of what else would make the Netanyahu government, which has been incredibly resistant to these kinds of agreements and these particular capitulations, what would make them all of a sudden agree? Can you?
No, I just don't see where that comes from, even if Trump's pressing hard. Because I think it's pretty clear that if this agreement goes through, it's going to collapse Netanyahu's government.